Hey y'all, this is Mr. Roseman, and this is an overview of Latin American revolutions, which fits into the context of the Atlantic Revolution. So, this is part two of the Atlantic revolutions. Last time we considered the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. We'll touch on those, but we'll continue that trend of the historical process of the Latin American revolutions here as part of the Atlantic revolutions movement. Later on, we will also look at how Latin American nations dealt with issues not long after independence into the late 1800s, early 1900s. But first, this will cover again the Latin American revolutions as part of the context of the Atlantic revolutions. So here we've got a map of what Latin America looked like right before the Latin American revolutions were underway. So recall that by the late 1700s, Spain had four viceroyalties. Recall that a viceroyalty is a royal colony of Spain. So we had the viceroyalty of New Spain, which included Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands, many of them at least. And the second viceroyalty was the viceroyalty of Peru here in the Andes of South America, what had previously been mostly the Inca Empire. And then by the later 1700s as well, two more viceroyalties were created: the viceroyalty of New Granada here in northern South America, and the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata in southern South America, what's today Argentina and Chile. You'll also remember that Brazil had the colony of Brazil, Portugal had the colony of Brazil established in South America. That was its only colony in South America, but of tremendous value to Brazil because of its production of sugarcane, especially. Sugarcane and gold, the sugarcane being the number one key export there. So this is a massive amount of property that the Spanish and the Portuguese empires control. At the time that the Atlantic revolutions are breaking out, beginning with the American, French, and then Haitian. So we know that though the former Atlantic revolutions are going to be inspiration to those that occur here in Latin America. So we'll see the links between all of these. So there are four main causes that I'm going to emphasize today that led to the Latin American revolutions. And you want to note here that those Latin American revolutions are happening between 1810 and the mid 1820s. So that by around 1830, almost all of Latin America has become independent. There were a few stragglers like Cuba and Puerto Rico that were still at that point part of the Spanish Empire. But by around 1830, most of Latin America has gained its independence. But here are the four main causes. You can boil them down to. For one, surprise, surprise, the Enlightenment values are going to have a heavy impact here in Latin America. Creole discontent and the unpopular Bourbon reforms. So not to say that other groups weren't satisfied within the Casa system, but the Creoles are going to wind up leading most of these revolutions in Latin America. We have direct inspiration from the American and French revolutions. And then what is going to be the trigger event for these revolutions to break out are the fact that Spain and Portugal are going to be caught up in the Napoleonic Wars. We'll see that expansion of Napoleon in the very early 1800s into or throughout Western Europe and into Eastern Europe. But one of his destinations for conquest was Iberia, which is Spain and Portugal. So by doing so, it destabilizes the Iberian Peninsula, and that is the perfect time for these revolutions to break out. So let's recall here those four, go into a little bit more detail. Again, it shouldn't be a surprise for every one of these Atlantic revolutions. The Enlightenment plays a critical role in inspiring revolutions. It also helps to guide the thought process behind creating new governments in these Atlantic revolution nations, those nations that experience the Atlantic revolution. So right now, think of what some of those Enlightenment values are. just jot them down, or at least think through what are some of the key Enlightenment values that are floating through here in the Atlantic world. Okay, so a couple things should have popped into your minds. Here's a couple of those. For one, the idea of natural rights. We know John Locke expressed the ideas of natural rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and property, and that government has the essential role of protecting those natural rights of its citizens. And if it does not protect those natural rights, then the citizens of that nation have a right to revolt against the government and establish a new government that does protect those natural rights. We know that beyond Locke, Voltaire also explained that there were further clarifications needed on natural rights, including ideas of freedom of speech and press and religion, separation of church and state. Most Enlightenment thinkers also did not buy into the idea that rulers should claim the divine right to rule. That's kind of, it doesn't make any sense why someone should rule just because they make a claim that God has ordained them the right to rule. We know the Enlightenment thinkers also encourage the idea of limited government, and one way that could happen is by creating constitutions. We saw that in other Atlantic revolutions. The idea of limited monarchy. If you're going to have a monarch, at least restrict what they do, and in some cases, perhaps being anti-monarch. So putting power into the hands of the people, which is the idea of popular sovereignty. Therefore, representative democracy, also known as a republic, would be ideal. So there's your democracy and republic. So republic having citizens elect people to positions of representation within government, whether it's parliament, Congress, some sort of general assembly, or an executive leader. And the ideals of the ideology of liberalism. So remember that that's not the equivalent of the Democratic Party's views. This is the ideology that grows out of the Atlantic Revolution. So this would include giving limited voting rights or suffrage or enfranchisement to certain groups in the population, having certain rights but not all rights to everybody. So there's limitations to Enlightenment ideas that are going to be actually applied. Nonetheless, these are all Enlightenment values that are pouring into Latin America, especially as the previous Atlantic revolutions are underway and start to see results. So the type of people that would be most open to these Enlightenment values would not be so much Peninsulars, since they are from Spain and want to maintain their elite status and being tied to Spain, but more so Creoles. They're the ones who are going to have the education, the literacy to be able to gain a hold of these ideas straight from the source, although those Enlightenment values will trickle down to the other lower castes too, even if they're illiterate. So Amerindians, black slaves in the Americas, they will gain those ideas too. So every different group will have a different interpretation of what it means to apply Enlightenment values. All right, so a little bit more on the Creoles. Another major factor for promoting these Latin American revolutions is Creole discontent. So we know the whole Castas system developed beginning in the very late 1400s, early 1500s, and highly elaborate social hierarchy based on racial distinctions and mixed races. But the Creoles, remember that they were Spaniards who were born in the Americas. That distinguishes them from the Peninsulars. So those are people of Spanish ancestry or European ancestry, but born back in the Iberian Peninsula, born in Spain or Portugal, and then moved here. But by the 1800s, early 1800s, by 1800, Creoles had outnumbered Peninsulars, and they have this increasing identity of being Americans, not European. So they might be of European ancestry, but because they have this long-term attachment to being born in the Americas, perhaps several generations of them being born in the Americas, they have greater ties to an American identity than a European identity. But like the Peninsulars, Creoles, most of them were pretty well off. Um, Peninsulars and Creoles both had access to, oftentimes were ones controlling land or had land ownership in the Americas. So that would allow them access to controlling plantations and haciendas, those big ranching estates, mining ventures, particular silver we know in Spanish America. Um, and again, they're the ones who are most directly inspired by the Enlightenment ideas pouring in from across the Atlantic world. Um, However, because of their elite status, only second to the Peninsulars, fellow whites, the Creoles, because they're wealthy, because they're landowners, and because they have control over the economy in large part alongside Peninsulars, they are not really interested whatsoever in changing the social hierarchy, getting rid of the casta system. They want to maintain their specific power. The only change they would really like to see is kicking out the Peninsulars, sending them back to Spain. Um, and that makes sense because they're reliant on mixed castas like mulattoes, mestizos, but especially Amerindians and blacks associated with slavery, chattel slavery. They rely on them for their economic well being, their labor force. So it would make no sense for them to want to grant Enlightenment freedoms to those people below them. So if there's going to be a revolution, they want to do it in a way that's going to maintain their own power. It also makes sense that, like elsewhere in the Atlantic world, men are going to try to dominate, considering this is a patriarchal society still. Um, they are not interested in extending Enlightenment rights to women necessarily. All right, so increasingly, Creoles seeing themselves as Americans, but they have a really nice position in the castas hierarchy of Latin America. The thing that really gets to them, though, that's really going to push them towards wanting to push for revolutions, are the Bourbon reforms. In the late 1700s, or by the time of the mid to late 1700s, the Spanish government started trying to crack down on what they saw as these unruly Creoles, particularly ones in high-ranking bureaucratic positions in the viceroyalties. They also attempted, with these Bourbon reforms, the Spanish crown attempted to clamp down tighter on the Latin American economies. So here's what happens. By the late 1700s, right before these revolutions hit Latin America, Creoles are kicked out of the highest bureaucratic positions. But Peninsulars, they're going to maintain their positions as people like viceroys and really high-ranking bureaucratic positions. So there's increased resentment toward the Peninsulars. They are also going to despise increased royal monopolies on certain products, like products that were considered essential for the success of the colony. Things like tobacco and gunpowder. The Creoles, considering that a lot of them have their own plantations and haciendas and mine operations, they would rather have free trade. So therefore, because that would mean more money for them. If they were able to make choices, economic choices that would benefit the Creoles, that would mean more money for them. So we see this stronger anti-mercantilist attitude amongst these Creoles. Kind of as a, I don't know, consolation prize for being stripped of all of these powers and being more controlled economically by the Spanish government. The Spanish government did make Creoles, some of them, in charge of local militias. So militias being local armies. That was a terrible idea, though, because at the same time the Creoles or the Spanish crown was ticking off the Creole population, they just gave them the means by which they could potentially rise up against Spain. I don't know what they were thinking. But nonetheless, the Creoles, some given positions of leadership for local armies. So, the only thing really stopping them from having a revolution earlier, around the same time as the American, French, or Haitian revolutions, is the fact that they really are concerned about losing their high social standing. So if they're going to have a revolution, they want to have it at a time when it's going to be fit and suitable for them to maintain control over those revolutions so they could lead themselves into power and assert dominance in these new governments, new independent governments. All right, so upcoming will be that trigger moment that the Creoles will seize the opportunity to gain control. All right. The third thing was direct inspiration from the American and French revolutions. We know the American Revolution set a standard for what an Enlightenment-inspired revolution would look like, and the fact that you could claim independence and successfully break free from a metropole, or remember, a metropole is a mother nation. And at the time that the revolutions were underway, the American government had been in existence for at least 20 years. French Revolution, we know, was a bit more turbulent, a lot more bloody, and greater instability. But we know that coming out on the other end of the French Revolution are leaders like Napoleon, these first modern rulers of modern nations like France, who were self-made men. So that served as inspiration for some of these Creoles. They take that inspiration of the American and French revolutions, who apply or inspired by Enlightenment ideas themselves, and make attempts at applying Enlightenment ideas and creating republics. Latin American Creoles and others in the lower Casa system, they want the same thing. So lots of inspiration from those previous Atlantic Revolution examples. The fourth thing, though, and this is that trigger event, is the fact that Napoleon rose to power. And I told you that he has major ripple effects worldwide. We're not going to worry ourselves too much about what he's doing in Western Europe, except to say that not only is he serving as dictator of France, but he tried to make that massive French empire using the Napoleonic Wars. And one of his key targets was the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And if you remember, one of the things that he did in any nation that he conquered was he removed the old absolute monarchs, the old dynasties from those European nations, and he would replace them with family members. And that's exactly what he does to Spain. All right, so in 1807, he invades Spain, and he actually captures the former king of Spain, Ferdinand VII. It says here he's in exile. He actually winds up in prison for a while, I believe. And in place of the legitimate king, Ferdinand VII, Napoleon places one of his older brothers on the throne of Spain, Joseph Bonaparte. He takes the title of King Jose. All right. So it's a little bit different, though, for Portugal's king. So whenever Napoleon invades their king, and don't laugh, I'm pretty sure this is how you pronounce it from other things I've heard. His name's Dom João VI. I'll say it again just because I like it. João VI. He's going to run off to Brazil. So that's a bit different from what happens to Spain's king. Spain's king runs off. He's still in Europe, but he's kicked off the throne of Spain, and Napoleon's older brother is placed on the throne there. So it looks like an illegitimate king's on the throne, whereas Portugal's king is going to run off to their colony in the Americas, Brazil. So this is going to be a destabilizing factor for the Spanish colonies, but it's going to have the opposite effect for Portugal's colony of Brazil. So let's look at Spain, the Spanish colonies first. All right. So we know the Creoles, they want independence. They want to lead revolutions if there's going to be revolutions. So here they see, here's our moment. The Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, he's gone. There's a foreigner that's in charge of Spain. We're going to seize power. So what some of the Creoles do, those Creoles who had control over local militias, and this is happening across Spanish America, those Creoles are going to set up what are known as juntas. It looks like juntas, but it's pronounced juntas. Juntas. And these are organizations of military leaders. So think of it like a military government. The Creoles are going to seize power from Peninsulars because they're panicking about what's happening back in Spain. Creoles seize power. They proclaim juntas, that they are in charge of these viceroyalties, and they claim to be representing Ferdinand VII, the true Spanish king. All right, but really this is a front for these Creoles pushing for their own independence. All right, so Creoles are taking the charge in almost all of these Latin American examples for the Spanish Empire. All right, so again, Creoles established these juntas. They claim they're ruling in the name of King Ferdinand while Spain is unstable. All right, but that's their opportunity to declare independence. And once Spain is starting to stabilize again and Joseph Bonaparte is kicked out, that's whenever these revolutions in a violent form take place, because the Spanish are going to try to rush in and take power back from the Creoles who are declaring their independence. So think of it kind of like how our founding fathers in the the American colonies, including people like Thomas Jefferson, declared independence, and then the British are going to rush in to try to put down this rebellion, this revolution. Well, the Spanish do the same thing here for those Spanish viceroyalties that are going to claim independence. We're going to come back to Brazil in just a little bit because their path is different to revolutions. But again, Napoleon's invasion, that sets up the perfect situation for these Creoles to declare independence by organizing these really quick overthrows of government, claiming military leadership with juntas. All right, so those are major causes. There's certainly more, all right, but those are some major ones, including those anti-mercantilist feelings. But here's your order of Latin American independence movements. First, technically, Haiti is the first location of a Latin American independence movement. But you know that was from France. But in terms of the first Iberian or Spanish or Portuguese colonies, areas to gain independence or to carry out revolutions, first we've got Mexico, 1810 to 1821, and Spanish America in two different movements are going to have their revolutions from 1810 to 1825, and then Brazil will be last in 1822. And again, they're the oddball because the Portuguese king Dom João ran off to Brazil, so it would be a lot harder for Brazil to declare independence if they're being directly ruled by the Portuguese king in the colony. So we'll come back to that again in a few minutes. So let's look at a quick recap of Haiti, and then we'll move on to Mexico and Spanish South America. All right, so for the Haitian Revolution, you know this, we've done this so much. It's a French Caribbean sugar colony originally, first formerly called Saint-Domingue. The majority of people were enslaved. They were African chattel slaves at the mercy of French plantation owners. And the first major slave movement here for revolutions was carried out by Toussaint Louverture. The first goal was slavery abolition. And then the second goal, understanding that really the only way abolition was going to happen was if Haiti gained its independence. He's leading them towards that movement. Napoleon here also shows up, had an attempted invasion that fails, and he decides to just give up on Haiti, grants them their independence. It's the very first free black nation in the Western Hemisphere, the first free black republic, but it slips into a dictatorship. So the big question here, and tying into the Latin American revolutions, is why would the Haitian Revolution, all right, why would that be something that Creoles in Latin America would fear? And it makes sense. This was a slave revolution, slaves rising up. That's the social order turning upside down. You know that slaves mostly killed their former masters. Well, Creoles don't want that happening. They want to move into independence as the new leaders of these republics within Spanish America, or former Spanish America and Portuguese America. So this is something to be feared. They don't want to change to the whole social order. They just want the Peninsula gone. They just want their metropoles to go back to Europe and leave them alone in independence. All right, so the very first center of Spanish or independence movements or revolutions in Spanish America was Mexico. And there's actually two parts to this, but it lasts from 1810 to 1821. The first revolution, or attempt at revolution, was carried out by a man named Father Miguel Hidalgo. He was a Creole, a preacher within the Catholic Church. You know that throughout Latin America, Catholicism is a primary faith. But he's going to rally. So even though he was a Creole, as a Catholic priest, he actually tried reaching out to the lower classes, the lower castas. He rallied Amerindians, most of which were poor peasants, alongside mestizos. And originally, Creoles were in favor of Hidalgo, considering that he was a fellow Creole himself. But whenever the lower castas that he was leading started attacking Creole property, they turned on him and decided that he shouldn't be leading this revolution if he's going to turn, again, the casta system upside down and disrespect Creoles and their property. So Hidalgo was actually captured and executed. So for a brief time, the revolution came to an end until a man who saw that there was an opportunity to gain power for himself, Augustin de Iturbide, I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce his name. This is another Creole. He saw that by leading a revolution organized by Creoles and made up primarily by Creoles, he could perhaps step into power over a new and independent Mexico, free of Spain. So by 1821, Mexico has gained its independence under the leadership of Iturbide. So if asked about who led the Mexican Revolution, you could use either Father Hidalgo or Iturbide. Either one will work for our purposes. Just know that Iturbide is the one who's finally leading Mexico into its independence. And just a side note, he's going to proclaim himself Emperor of Mexico, Mexico becoming an empire in and of itself. That only lasts a couple months, so Iturbide winds up upsetting most of the Creoles because he starts acting like an absolute monarch. We'll see quite a bit of that happening over and over again within Latin America. Let's move on to South America, Spanish South America. Here we're going to have independence movements taking place at the same time in two different locations within South America. Northern South America and Southern South America. So we're going to deal with Northern South America first. This guy here, of all the different revolutionary leaders for Latin America that you should know, it's got to be Simón Bolívar. This guy here, Simón Bolívar. He is highly inspired by the Enlightenment. He's an idealist. And of all of the different revolutionary thinkers, he's the most liberal, I would say. And he had this grand vision of what an independent South America would look like. Simón Bolívar, he was from Venezuela, a Creole, quality background in terms of wealth and education. But he's one of these guys that proclaims a junta, a military dictatorship, or military government, during this time that Spain is preoccupied with the Napoleonic Wars. He gains the nickname the Liberator because he helped to liberate most of South America in combination with another Creole, José de San Martin, who's going to come up from the south. All right, so here are his ultimate goals. He wants independence for South America, but he also wants to unite South America as a single country. Think of it like a United States of South America. He wanted to form a nation like the United States of America, but here in South America. That doesn't happen if you know your South American nations. But independence does come. So he's one of these Creoles. He creates a junta and seizes the opportunity to declare these areas of northern South America independent. By the early 1820s, he's gained independence for Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. And eventually, he's going to make an attempt to unite this into a single country of Gran Colombia. But this will not last. It will fall back apart into these three individual countries of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. All right, so this is a short-term vision. It doesn't wind up playing out due to vast differences in culture within South America. But this shows the visionary ideals of some of these Creoles that are inspired by the Enlightenment. All right, so from the south of South America, southern South America, coming out of the Rio de la Plata, you have José de San Martin. And he's very much like Simón Bolívar. They actually wind up meeting together to finish off the Spanish forces in South America to proclaim ultimate independence for all of Spanish South America. But like Bolivar, he's looking for independence and uniting South America. So he's a visionary too, in a positive way. He's highly inspired by the Enlightenment. He's a Creole too, like Bolivar and Iturbide. And he also established a junta there in the Rio de la Plata, what becomes Argentina and Chile. So, like Bolivar, and this is happening at the same time as Bolivar, he's going to win victories against royalists, Spanish royalists in southern South America. So, moving from what's today Buenos Aires in Argentina to Chile and moving up towards Peru. And at the same time that Bolivar is fighting Spanish royalists in the north, they wind up meeting and having a final showdown against the Spanish. All right, so there's your process. Here you can see where Simon Bolivar, starting in Venezuela, moving southward. They meet in Peru, meeting with San Martin. So here's San Martin moving up that coast of South America. So by 1822 or by 1830, really, you've got most of Latin America independent. All right, so that covers Spanish South America and Mexico. We now need to turn our attention to the oddball of Brazil, the Portuguese colony of Brazil. So here's how it's different. For Brazilian independence, because Portugal's king moved and ran away to Brazil, their only colony in the Americas, Brazil was actually elevated in importance during the time that their king, Dom João, moved to, or was there during the Napoleonic Wars. All right. So during the length of the Napoleonic Wars, Brazil is firmly under Portuguese control, considering that it's elevated to this central position for the Portuguese Empire. So that's going on while all these Creoles in Spanish South America and Mexico are carrying out their revolutions and declaring independence. Brazil staying firmly tied to Portugal. All right. But it also makes sense that the Brazilian Creoles would not want to lead a revolution unless it's under their terms, because, think about it, who makes up the vast majority of the population that are not white Europeans? If you said African slaves, you're right, because Brazil was a sugarcane producing colony. Almost 50% of the population was enslaved. So those are people that you would want to keep in positions of subjugation because, well, they're producing your labor. They're carrying out your labor for you, making you rich. So that's why revolutions like the Haitian Revolution, which was largely just a slave revolt, or was largely a slave revolt, you would not want something like that inspiring slaves to revolt too here in Brazil. So here's how this happened for Brazil gaining independence. The Portuguese king, Dom João VI, he runs off to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1807. All right, so he's trying to escape those problems of Napoleon. So he comes to Brazil. Rio de Janeiro is elevated to the center of this Portuguese empire. By the time that Napoleon is declining in importance, all right, and declining in power, and being removed from power, Dom João will wind up returning back to Portugal. So suddenly Brazil is brought back to the reality of what they were before the Napoleonic Wars, a colony to the metropole of Portugal. Fortunately for Brazil, Dom João left his son. This is his son right here. This is Dom Pedro I as regent. All right, so basically meaning that an extension of the Portuguese royal family is left in charge of Brazil. All right, the son of King Dom João. So João knew where the wind was turning, how the wind was blowing with these Atlantic revolutions. He knew that Brazil was just a matter of time before they would also declare independence. So it made sense that he would name his son as leader of Brazil upon his departure. And he pretty much told his son, Pedro, that if Brazil's going to get its independence, I want you to lead it, all right? And it's going to be under your terms. So Pedro, all right, in 1821, he's going to declare himself Emperor of Brazil, the new Kingdom of Brazil, or the Brazilian Empire, which you may never have heard of before. But it lasts until the late 1800s, the Brazilian Empire. So it's technically a republic, all right? So it'll be a monarchy, a Brazilian monarchy, with a liberal constitution. So voting rights for members of parliament going to just the equivalent of Creoles in Brazil, landowners. No surprise there. And the same thing will happen in those new states that form in what used to be the Spanish Empire of the Americas. So there was no large revolution, all right? No major violence that happens in Brazil for independence. It's a general peaceful transfer of power from Portugal, the metropole of Portugal, over to Dom Pedro as the leader of the Kingdom of Brazil. So tomorrow, hopefully, we will look at the results of these Latin American revolutions. But certainly by 1830, you can see all of these areas that have gained independence as a result of those Latin American revolutions. So Mexico, Gran Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and then that former colony of Brazil, former Portuguese colony of Brazil. All right. So there we go. Y'all have a good evening.